a spine-tingling, nerve-shattering podcast featuring all your favorite monsters. You won't believe your ears when you listen to Monster Kid Radio. Hear your host, Derek M. Cook, and his ever-rotating stable of guests discuss your favorite classics and sometimes not-so-classic monster movies. Subscribe to Monster Kid Radio through iTunes or Stitcher, or visit monsterkidradio.net before the next weekly episode of Monster Kid Radio. Go through the archives for interviews with Sara, Victoria Price, and Joel Hodgson. Listen to discussions about movies like Creature from the Black Lagoon, Island of Terror, and King Kong. And don't forget convention coverage from Monster Bash and the H.P. Lovecraft Film Festival. Classic Monsters, Modern Talk, and the Head of Rondo Hatton. Only on Monster Kid Radio.
Do you like the Tales from the Crypt? Do you love the Tales from the Crypt? Even if you've never seen an episode, this podcast is for you. I'm Melissa, your ghostess with the mostest, and host of the Good Evening Kiddies podcast. Each week, I break down another great episode from the TV series The Tales from the Crypt. Audio clips are included, so even if you haven't watched that episode, you're good to go. There are also special guests, trivia, mini movie reviews, and much more. What are you waiting for? Check out the Good Evening Kiddies podcast on Podbean, Apple Podcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. That's the Good Evening Kiddies podcast. Check it out today.
Greetings, listeners. We're back once again to talk to you about the Cthulhu mythos, its books, its monsters, its unfortunate human casualties, its timeline in general, and even its tangential bits, like the Dreamlands, or things of a weird nature, or things that are Lovecraftian leaning. Weird fiction, science fiction, horror. Learn of terrible meetings in lonely places, of cyclopean ruins, and vast staircases that lead down to abysses of nighted secrets, of complex angles that lead through invisible walls to other regions of space and time, and of hideous explorations in remote and forbidden places, on other worlds, and in different time-space continua. From the creation of our galaxy to the death of the sun, this is an exploration of the Cthulhu mythos from the perspective of humans' concept of history. We are the people's guide to the Cthulhu mythos. You can find us at PGTTCM.com, PGTTCM.podbean.com, and you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. The People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos starts now.
The People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos. Season 8.
Reading 809. Reading 84 through 89. This episode is brought to you by FoundItemClothing.com and BunnySlippers.com. Subscribe to us at PGTTCM all over social media. We are DV Spitzer and Sara most of the time, and you can subscribe to our podcast wherever you subscribe to podcasts. We recommend Podbean and Apple Podcasts. Check us out at PGTTCM.com and go to PGTTCM.threadless.com to pick up some cool merch. As I said, we're all over social media as PGTTCM, specifically Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And if YouTube's more of your thing, or you want to suggest us to someone who doesn't listen to podcasts, send them over to People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos on the YouTubes. Written and edited by Daniel Spitzer. Audio edited by Daniel Spitzer. Music by Kevin MacLeod. And the following pieces are used in this episode. The Chamber, Oppressive Gloom, The Sky of Our Ancestors. Help the show by sharing, rating, liking, or 5-star giving wherever you listen to, subscribe to, rate, or whatever podcasts. Support the show by hitting the Patreon button at the top of pgttcm.podbean.com. Donate what you want. We'll get you part of the scheme. Hey, it'll be cool. PGTTCM is part of the Dark Myths Collective. Learn more at pgttcm.com or darkmyths.org. A Dreamer's Tale is the 5th book by Irish fantasy writer Lord Dunsany, considered a major influence on the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, H.P. Lovecraft, Ursula K. Guin, and a whole bunch of other people. It was first published in hardcover by George Allen and Sons in September 1910. The following stories are collected in this week's recordings. Preface: Poltarnees, Beholder of Ocean; Blagdaross, The Madness of Andelsprutz, Where the Tides Ebb and Flow; Bethmoora, Idle Days on the Yon; The Sword and the Idle City; The Hashish Man; Poor Old Bill; The Beggars; Carcassonne; In Zakkarath; The Field; The Day of the Pole; The Unhappy Body. Read by David Mack. Let's get started. People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos begins now.
The Madness of Andelsprutz. I first saw the city of Andelsprutz on an afternoon in spring. The day was full of sunshine as I came by the way of the fields, and all that morning I had said, "There will be sunlight on it when I see for the first time the beautiful conquered city, whose fame has so often made for me lovely dreams." Suddenly I saw its fortifications lifting out of the fields, and behind them stood its belfries. I went in by a gate and saw its houses and streets, and a great disappointment came upon me. For there is an air about a city, and it has a way with it whereby a man may recognize one from another at once. There are cities full of happiness, and cities full of pleasure, and cities full of gloom. There are cities with faces to heaven, and some with their faces to earth. Some have a way of looking at the past, and others look at the future. Some notice you if you come among them, others glance at you, others let you go by. Some love the cities that are their neighbors, others are dear to the plains and to the heath. Some cities are bare to the wind, others have purple cloaks, and others brown cloaks, and some are clad in white. Some tell the old tale of their infancy, with others it is secret. Some cities sing, and some mutter, some are angry, and some have broken hearts, and each city has her way of greeting time. I had said, I will see Andelsprutz arrogant with her beauty, and I had said, I will see her weeping over her conquest. I had said, she will sing songs to me, and she will be reticent. She will be all robed, and she will be bare but splendid. But the windows of Andelsprutz and her houses looked vacantly over the plains like the eyes of a dead madman. At the hour her chimes sounded unlovely and discordant. Some of them were out of tune, and the bells of some were cracked. Her roofs were bald and without moss. At evening no pleasant rumor arose in her streets. When the lamps were lit in the houses, no mystical flood of light stole out into the dusk. You merely saw that there were lighted lamps. Andelsprutz had no way with her and no air about her. When the night fell and the blinds were all drawn down, then I perceived what I had not thought in the daylight. I knew then that Andelsprutz was dead. I saw a fair-haired man who drank beer in a cafe, and I said to him, "Why is the city of Andelsprutz quite dead, and her soul gone hence?" He answered, "Cities do not have souls, and there is never any life in bricks." And I said to him, "Sir, you have spoken truly." And I asked the same question of another man, and he gave me the same answer, and I thanked him for his courtesy. And I saw a man of a more slender build, who had black hair and channels in his cheeks for tears to run in. And I said to him, "Why is Andelsprutz quite dead, and when did her soul go hence?" And he answered, "Andelsprutz."
We'd like to thank you for listening to People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos. Our sponsor is BunnySlippers.com, your finest source of wonderful Cthulhu slippers and cool shirts from FoundItemClothing.com, your favorite shirts from your favorite cult films, and also these fine folks.
Hoped too much. For 30 years would she stretch out her arms toward the land of Akla every night, to Mother Akla, from whom she had been stolen. Every night she would be hoping and sighing and stretching out her arms to Mother Akla. At midnight, once a year, on the anniversary of the terrible day, Akla would send spies to lay a wreath against the walls of Andelsprutz. She could do no more. And on this night, once in every year, I used to weep, for weeping was the mood of the city that nursed me. Every night, while other cities slept, did Andelsprutz sit brooding here and hoping, till 30 wreaths lay mouldering by her walls, and still the armies of Akla could not come. But after she had hoped so long, and on the night that faithful spies had brought her 30th wreath, Andelsprutz went suddenly mad. All the bells clanged hideously in the belfries, horses bolted in the streets, the dogs all howled. The stolid conquerors awoke and turned in their beds and slept again. And I saw the gray shadowy form of Andelsprutz rise up, decking her hair with the phantasms of cathedrals, and stride away from her city. And the great shadowy form that was the soul of Andelsprutz went away muttering to the mountains, and there I followed her, for had she not been my nurse? Yes, I went away alone into the mountains, and for 3 days, wrapped in a cloak, I slept in their misty solitudes. I had no food to eat, and to drink I had only the water of the mountain streams. By day no living thing was near to me, and I heard nothing but the noise of the wind and the mountain streams roaring. But for 3 nights I heard all around me on the mountains the sounds of a great city. I saw the lights of tall cathedral windows flash momentarily on the peaks, and at times the glimmering lantern of some fortress patrol. And I saw the misty outline of the soul of Andelsprutz, sitting decked with her ghostly cathedrals, speaking to herself, with her eyes fixed before her in a mad stare, telling of ancient wars. And her confused speech for all those nights upon the mountain was sometimes the voice of traffic, and then of church bells, and then of bugles, but oftenest it was the voice of red war, and it was all incoherent, and she was quite mad. The 3rd night it rained heavily all night long, but I stayed up there to watch the soul of my native city, and she still sat staring straight before her, raving. But her voice was gentler now. There were more chimes in it, and occasional song. Midnight passed, and the rain still swept down on me, and still the solitudes of the mountain were full of the mutterings of the poor mad city, and the hours after midnight came, the cold hours wherein sick men die. Suddenly I was aware of great shapes moving in the rain, and heard the sound of voices that were not of my city, nor yet of any that I ever knew. And presently I discerned, though faintly, the souls of a great concourse of cities, all bending over Andelsprutz and comforting her. And the ravines of the mountains roared that night with the voices of cities that had lain still for centuries. For there came the soul of Camelot that had so long ago forsaken Usk, and there was Ilion, all girt with towers, still cursing the sweet face of ruinous Helen. I saw there Babylon and Persepolis, and the bearded face of bull-like Nineveh, and Athens, mourning her immortal gods. All these souls of cities that were dead spoke that night on the mountain to my city, and soothed her, until at last she muttered of war no longer, and her eyes stared wildly no more. But she hid her face in her hands, and for some while wept softly. At last she arose, and walking slowly with bended head, and leaning upon Ilion and Carthage, went mournfully eastwards. And the dust of her highways swirled behind her as she went, a ghostly dust that never turned to mud in all that drenching rain. And so the souls of the cities led her away, and gradually they disappeared from the mountain, and the ancient voices died away in the distance. Not since then have I seen my city alive, But once I met with a traveler who said that somewhere in the midst of a great desert are gathered together the souls of all dead cities. He said that he was lost once in a place where there was no water, and he heard their voices speaking all the night. But I said I was once without water in a desert, and heard a city speaking to me, but knew not whether it really spoke to me or not, for on that day I heard so many terrible things, and only some of them were true. And the man with the black hair said, I believe it to be true, though whither she went I know not. I only know that a shepherd found me in the morning faint with hunger and cold, and carried me down here. And when I came to Andelsprutz, it was, as you have perceived it, dead. Where the tides ebb and flow. I dreamt that I had done a horrible thing, so that burial was to be denied me either in soil or sea, neither could there be any hell for me. I waited for some hours knowing this. Then my friends came for me and slew me secretly and with ancient rite, and lit great tapers and carried me away. It was all in London that the thing was done, and they went furtively at dead of night along grey streets and among mean houses, until they came to the river. And the river and the tide of the sea were grappling with one another between the mudbanks, and both of them were black and full of lights. A sudden wonder came into the eyes of each, as my friends came near to them with their glaring tapers. All these things I saw as they carried me dead and stiffening, for my soul was still among my bones, because there was no hell for it, and because Christian burial was denied me. They took me down a stairway that was green with slimy things, and so came slowly to the terrible mud. There in the territory of forsaken things they dug a shallow grave. When they had finished, they laid me in the grave, and suddenly they cast their tapers to the river. And when the water had quenched the flaring lights, the tapers looked pale and small as they bobbed upon the tide. And at once the glamour of the calamity was gone, and I noticed then the approach of the huge dawn, and my friends cast their cloaks over their faces, and the solemn procession was turned into many fugitives that furtively stole away. Then the mud came back wearily and covered all but my face. There I lay alone with quite forgotten things, with drifting things that the tides will take no farther, with useless things and lost things, and with the horrible unnatural bricks that are neither stone nor soil. I was rid of feeling, because I had been killed, but perception and thought were in my unhappy soul. The dawn widened, and I saw the desolate houses that crowded the marge of the river, and their dead windows peered into my dead eyes, windows with veils behind them instead of human souls. I grew so weary looking at these forlorn things that I wanted to cry out, but could not because I was dead. Then I knew, as I had never known before, that for all the years that herd of desolate houses had wanted to cry out too, but being dead, were dumb. And I knew then that it had yet been well with the forgotten drifting things if they had wept, but they were eyeless and without life. And I too tried to weep, but there were no tears in my dead eyes. And I knew then that the river might have cared for us, might have caressed us, might have sung to us, but he swept broadly onwards, thinking of nothing but the princely ships. At last the tide did what the river would not, and came and covered me over, and my soul had rest in the green water, and rejoiced and believed that it had the burial of the sea. But with the ebb, the water fell again, and left me alone again with the callous mud among the forgotten things that drift no more, and with the sight of all those desolate houses, and with the knowledge among all of us that each was dead. In the mournful wall behind me, hung with green weeds, forsaken of the sea, dark tunnels appeared, and secret narrow passages that were clamped and barred. From these at last the stealthy rats came down to nibble me away, and my soul rejoiced thereat, and believed that he would be free perforce from the accursed bones to which burial was refused. Very soon the rats ran away a little space and whispered among themselves. They never came any more. When I found that I was accursed even among the rats, I tried to weep again. Then the tide came swinging back and covered the dreadful mud, and hid the desolate houses, and soothed the forgotten things. And my soul had ease for a while in the sepulchre of the sea. And then the tide forsook me again. To and fro it came about me for many years. Then the county council found me, and gave me decent burial. It was the first grave that I had ever slept in. That very night my friends came for me. They dug me up and put me back again in the shallow hold in the mud. Again and again through the years my bones found burial, but always behind the funeral lurked one of those terrible men who, as soon as night fell, came and dug them up and carried them back again to the hole in the mud. And then one day the last of those men died who once had done to me this terrible thing. I heard his soul go over the river at sunset, and again I hoped. A few weeks afterwards I was found once more, and once more taken out of that restless place and given deep burial in sacred ground, where my soul hoped that it should rest. Almost at once men came with cloaks and tapers to give me back to the mud, for the thing had become a tradition and a rite. And all the forsaken things mocked me in their dumb hearts when they saw me carried back, for they were jealous of me because I had left the mud. It must be remembered that I could not weep. And the years went by seawards where the black barges go, and the great derelict centuries became lost at sea, and still I lay there without any cause to hope, and daring not to hope without a cause, because of the terrible envy and the anger of the things that could drift no more. Once a great storm rode up, even as far as London, out of the sea from the south, and he came curving into the river with the fierce east wind, and he was mightier than the dreary tides, and went with great leaps over the listless mud. And all the sad forgotten things rejoiced, and mingled with things that were haughtier than they, and rode once more amongst the lordly shipping that was driven up and down. And out of their hideous home he took my bones, never again, I hoped, to be vexed with the ebb and flow. And with the fall of the tide he went riding down the river, and turned to the southwards, and so went to his home. And my bones he scattered among many isles and along the shores of happy alien mainlands. And for a moment, while they were far asunder, my soul was almost free. Then there arose, at the will of the moon, the assiduous flow of the tide, and it undid at once the work of the ebb, and gathered my bones from the marge of sunny isles, and gleaned them all along the mainland's shores, and went rocking northwards till it came to the mouth of the Thames, and there turned westwards its relentless face, and so went up the river and came to the hole in the mud, and into it dropped my bones, and partly the mud covered them, and partly it left them white, for the mud cares not for its forsaken things. Then the ebb came, and I saw the dead eyes of the houses, and the jealousy of the other forgotten things that the storm had not carried thence. And some more centuries passed over the ebb and flow, and over the loneliness of things forgotten. And I lay there all the while in the careless grip of the mud, never wholly covered, yet never able to go free. And I longed for the great caress of the warm earth, or for the comfortable lap of the sea. Sometimes men found my bones and buried them, but the tradition never died, and my friends' successors always brought them back. At last the barges went no more, and there were fewer lights. Shaped timbers no longer floated down the fairway, and there came instead old wind-uprooted trees in all their natural simplicity. At last I was aware that somewhere near me a blade of grass was growing, and the moss began to appear all over the dead houses. One day some thistledown went drifting over the river. For some years I watched these signs attentively until I became certain that London was passing away. Then I hoped once more, and all along both banks of the river there was anger among the lost things that anything should dare to hope upon the forsaken mud. Gradually the horrible houses crumbled until the poor dead things that never had had life got decent burial among the weeds and moss. At last the May appeared and the convolvulus. Finally the wild rose stood up over the mounds that had been wharves and warehouses. Then I knew that the cause of nature had triumphed and London had passed away. The last man in London came to the wall by the river in an ancient cloak that was one of those that once my friends had worn, and peered over the edge to see that I was still there. Then he went, and I never saw men again. They had passed away with London. A few days after the last man had gone, the birds came into London, all the birds that sing. When they first saw me, they all looked sideways at me. Then they went away a little and spoke among themselves. He only sinned against man, they said. It is not our quarrel. Let us be kind to him, they said. Then they hopped nearer me and began to sing. It was the time of the rising of the dawn, and from both banks of the river, and from the sky, and from the thickets that were once the streets, hundreds of birds were singing. As the light increased, the birds sang more and more. They grew thicker and thicker in the air above my head, till there were thousands of them singing there, and then millions, and at last I could see nothing but a host of flickering wings with the sunlight on them, and little gaps of sky. Then, when there was nothing to be heard in London but the myriad notes of that exultant song, my soul rose up from the bones in the hole in the mud and began to climb heavenwards. And it seemed that a laneway opened amongst the wings of the birds, and it went up, and one of the smaller gates of paradise stood ajar at the end of it. And then I knew by a sign that the mud should receive me no more, for suddenly I found that I could weep. At this moment I opened my eyes in bed in a house in London, and outside some sparrows were twittering in a tree in the light of the radiant morning, and there were tears still wet upon my face, for one's restraint is feeble when one sleeps. But I arose and opened the window wide, and stretching my hands out over the little garden, I blessed the birds whose song had woken me up from the troubled and terrible centuries of my dream. Bethmoora. There is a faint freshness in the London night, as though some strayed reveller of a breeze had left his comrades in the Kentish uplands and had entered the town by stealth. The pavements are a little damp and shiny. Upon one's ears, that at this late hour have become very acute, there hits the tap of a remote footfall. Louder and louder grow the taps, filling the whole night, and a black-cloaked figure passes by and goes tapping into the dark. One who has danced goes homewards. Somewhere a ball has closed its doors and ended. Its yellow lights are out, its musicians are silent, its dancers have all gone into the night air, and time has said of it, "Let it be past and over, and among the things that I have put away." Shadows begin to detach themselves from their great gathering places. No less silently than those shadows that are thin and dead, move homewards the stealthy cats. Thus have we even in London our faint forebodings of the dawn's approach, which the birds and the beasts and the stars are crying aloud to the untrammeled fields. At what moment I know not, I perceive that the night itself is irrevocably overthrown. It is suddenly revealed to me, by the weary pallor of the street lamps, that the streets are silent and nocturnal still, not because there's any strength in night, but because men have not yet arisen from sleep to defy him. So have I seen dejected and untidy guards still bearing antique muskets in palatial gateways, although the realms of the monarch that they guard have shrunk to a single province, which no enemy has yet troubled to overrun. And it is now manifest from the aspect of the street lamps, those abashed dependents of night, that already English mountain peaks have seen the dawn, that the cliffs of Dover are standing white to the morning, that the sea mist has lifted and is pouring inland. And now men with a hose have come out and are sluicing out the streets. Behold now, night is dead. What memories, what fancies throng one's mind. A night but just now gathered out of London by the horrific hand of time. A million common artificial things all cloaked for a while in mystery, like beggars robed in purple and seated on dread thrones. 4 million people asleep, dreaming perhaps. What worlds have they gone into? Whom have they met? But my thoughts are far off with Bethmoora in her loneliness, whose gates swing to and fro. To and fro they swing, and creak in the wind, but no one hears them. They are of green copper, very lovely, but no one sees them now. The desert wind pours sand into their hinges. No watchman comes to ease them. No guard goes round Bethmoora's battlements. No enemy assails them. There are no lights in her houses, no footfall on her streets. She stands there, dead and lonely beyond the hills of Hap. And I would see Bethmoora once again, but dare not. It is many a year, they tell me, since Bethmoora became desolate. Her desolation is spoken of in taverns where sailors meet, and certain travelers have told me of it. I had hoped to see Bethmoora once again. It is many a year ago, they say, when the vintage was last gathered in from the vineyards that I knew, where it is all desert now. It was a radiant day, and the people of the city were dancing by the vineyards, while here and there one played upon the calapac. The purple flowering shrubs were all in bloom, and the snow shone upon the hills of Hap. Outside the copper gates they crushed the grapes in vats to make the syrubub. It had been a goodly vintage. In the little gardens at the desert's edge, men beat the tambang and the titibuk and blew melodiously the zudabar. All there was mirth and song and dance, because the vintage had been gathered in, and there would be ample syrubub for the winter months, and much left over to exchange for turquoises and emeralds with the merchants who come down from Oxuhan. Thus they rejoiced all day over their vintage on the narrow strip of cultivated ground that lay between Bethmoora and the desert which meets the sky to the south. And when the heat of the day began to abate, and the sun drew near to the snows on the hills of Hap, the note of the zudabar still rose clear from the gardens, and the brilliant dresses of the dancers still wound among the flowers. All that day 3 men on mules had been noticed crossing the face of the hills of Hap. Backwards and forwards they moved as the track wound lower and lower, 3 little specks of black against the snow. They were seen first in the very early morning up near the shoulder of Pale Yaganoth, and seemed to be coming out of Utnarvahi. All day they came, and in the evening, just before the lights come out and colors change, they appeared before Bethmoora's copper gates. They carried staves, such as messengers bear in those lands, and seemed somberly clad when the dancers all came round them with their green and lilac dresses. Those Europeans who were present and heard the message given were ignorant of the language and only caught the name of Utnarvahi, but it was brief and passed rapidly from mouth to mouth, and almost at once the people burnt their vineyards and began to flee away from Bethmoora, going for the most part northwards, though some went to the east. They ran down out of their fair white houses and streamed through the copper gate. The throbbing of the tambang and the titibuk suddenly ceased with the note of the zudabar, and the clinking calapac stopped a moment after. The 3 strange travelers went back the way they came the instant their message was given. It was the hour when a light would have appeared in some high tower, and window after window would have poured into the dusk its lion-frightening light, and the copper gates would have been fastened up. But no lights came out in windows there that night, and have not ever since. And those copper gates were left wide and have never shut. And the sound arose of the red fire crackling in the vineyards, and the pattering of feet fleeing softly. There were no cries, no other sounds at all, only the rapid and determined flight. They fled as swiftly and quietly as a herd of wild cattle flee when they suddenly see a man. It was as though something had befallen which had been feared for generations, which could only be escaped by instant flight, which left no time for indecision. Then fear took the Europeans also, and they too fled, and what the message was, I have never heard. Many believe that it was a message from Thubamlin, the mysterious emperor of those lands, who is never seen by man, advising that Bethmoora should be left desolate. Others say that the message was one of warning from the gods, whether from friendly gods or from adverse ones they know not. And others hold that the plague was ravaging a line of cities over in Ut-Narvahi, following the southwest wind which for many weeks had been blowing across them towards Bethmoora. Some say that the terrible Nusar sickness was upon the three travelers, and that their very mules were dripping with it, and suppose that they were driven to the city by hunger, but suggest no better reason for so terrible a crime. But most believe that it was a message from the desert himself, who owns all the earth to the southwards, spoken with his peculiar cry to those three who knew his voice, men who had been out on the sand wastes without tents by night, who had been by day without water, men who had been out there where the desert mutters, and had grown to know his needs and his malevolence. They say that the desert had a need for Bethmoora, that he wished to come into her lovely streets, and to send into her temples and her houses his storm winds draped with sand. For he hates the sound and the sight of men in his old evil heart, and he would have Bethmoora silent and undisturbed, save for the weird love he whispers to her gates. If I knew what that message was that the three men brought on mules and told in the copper gate, I think that I should go and see Bethmoora once again. For a great longing comes on me here in London to see once more that white and beautiful city, and yet I dare not, for I know not the danger I should have to face, whether I should risk the fury of unknown dreadful gods, or some disease unspeakable and slow, or the desert's curse, or a torture in some little private room of the Emperor Thubamlin, or something that the travelers have not told, perhaps more fearful still,